Hi, you're on the This Is Crime channel. I'm Matilda. Listen to my new story. The Assassination of Elinor Buggy. Life was finally starting to get better for James Buggy of Pennsylvania. It had been 3 years since his beloved wife Catherine passed away during childbirth, leaving him with the impossible task of keeping a steady job in the mine and raising a young daughter alone. For 3 long years, and hundreds of dreary nights, lying sleepless in the bedroom of his tiny house in Shamokin, he wondered how he would manage it all, and prayed for a miracle that never seemed to happen. And so, in January 1917, James's prayers were answered. The 30-year-old single father fell in love with a young Italian woman who lived next door. With hair as dark as anthracite and piercing eyes, 23-year-old Annie Campolo swept the lonely widower off his feet. And, to James's delight, the new favorite immediately attracted his daughter Elinor. Elinor was 3 years old, and raising a child is a difficult enough task, but James realized that his daughter was now at the age when she needed the care and love that a mother could best provide. Who could teach her to braid the hair of her favorite doll, sew buttons on her favorite blouse, and tend to the flowers in their little garden? James worked at the Burnside mine. He couldn't teach his beautiful girl any of those things. But Annie could. After a brief affair, James Buggy made Annie Campolo his wife. 4 weeks later, James realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Annie appeared to have a fiery temper, and although quarrels between the newlyweds were not uncommon, James decided he didn't want any scolding in his peaceful home. His first wife, Catherine, was a kind and gentle woman who never raised her voice. James himself was known among his friends and colleagues as a kind-hearted man who always put his faith and family first in his life. As a young man, he attended St. Edward Catholic School and was an active member of his church. He took pride in his community and never missed an opportunity to volunteer for a good cause. So when he learned that his new young wife was unfaithful in marriage, there was a terrible fight. On Sunday night, February 25, 1917, he explicitly told Annie that he wanted her out of the house by the time he returned from work the next day. The murder of Elinor Buggy. On Monday afternoon, James returned to his home and found his wife gone. Unfortunately, neither was his young daughter. James knocked on all the neighbors' doors and learned that Annie had last been seen just before 9 a.m. leaving the house with the little girl. Annie appeared to be in a hurry, but the neighbors didn't pay much attention to this since Annie's family lived on the same street. They figured that Annie had taken Elinor to her parents' house. James returned home and waited. He washed up after a day's work and made himself something to eat. But as the minutes began to turn into hours, and his wife and daughter were nowhere to be seen, he began to worry. He went to Annie's parents' house. Annie was home. When James demanded to know where his daughter was, Annie nonchalantly replied that she had taken the girl west of Edgewood Park, leaving Elinor between 2 large rocks. In his upset feelings, James must have thought his girl was lost, wandering alone and bewildered across the wooded hillside. It didn't occur to him that something far more sinister might have happened. He called a policeman named Charles Levan and insisted on forming a search party. Levan and a group of policemen detained Annie and demanded that she lead them to the place where she had left Elinor Buggy. Annie led the police and a handful of other concerned citizens through the darkness into the woods west of Edgewood. The light of the searchers' flashlights soon fell on 2 large boulders, but as the men crept toward the lonely, secluded spot, a puzzling discovery awaited them. The little girl was not there. The search party tramped through the bush looking for clues, and Annie insisted that she had left Elinor Buggy exactly where she had claimed. But hours later, not the slightest evidence could be found. No footprints, no clothes. Annie had to explain herself, and only then did she break down and confess. Armed with a potato knife, she took the 3-year-old girl into the woods. Officer Levan immediately dragged Annie to the city jail. Just after dawn on February 27, 1917, the barking of a dog in the distance caught the attention of James Buggy and his cousin Michael as they searched the hills along the road to Trevorton. It was the same dog that little Elinor often played with during her visits to her uncle's house. Up the steep hills, James followed the barking of the collie. After catching up with the dog, James rummaged through the bushes, but found no trace of his favorite daughter. The sun had not yet risen, and in the misty light, he continued his desperate search until a piece of red cloth caught his eye. James realized it was Elinor's scarf. James ran down the slope, ignoring the jagged rocks, and found his daughter's body on a pile of rocks at the foot of the mountain. He had not yet been told how Elinor had died. Words cannot describe the agony he felt as he turned his daughter over. Later that morning, another group of searchers found a potato knife and a locket in the woods that belonged to the girl's stepmother. The chain was broken, suggesting that Annie had either thrown it away in anger or little Elinor had snatched it from her stepmother's neck during a desperate struggle for survival. The body was taken to the Campton Funeral Home, where it was examined by Coroner Fred Steck the same day. Steck's examination revealed that the little girl had been killed by a cold weapon. Annie made a full confession to Officer Levan, stating that she made the decision to kill Elinor when James Buggy left for work. "I loved Elinor deeply and was traumatized by the thought of never seeing her again. Elinor was my husband's life. To kill the girl would have been the cruelest revenge." Annie told Levan that she sharpened the knife shortly after James left the house for work. She then dressed Elinor and led her to the place of death in a roundabout way so as not to arouse suspicion. After killing the girl, Annie ran to her parents' house. She told no one of her deed. It was a textbook example of cold, calculated, premeditated murder. Trial Annie Buggy appeared before a judge. The young woman was remanded to the Sunbury County Jail without bail. Her trial was scheduled to begin in May. Elinor Buggy's funeral was held the next morning at St. Joseph's Church. She was buried in St. Edward's Cemetery, next to her mother, who had died just 3 years earlier. In prison, Annie refused to testify, and it was said that her defense would be insanity. Surely no sane person would be capable of committing such a heartless crime. So whispered the town. The warden kept a close eye on her because he feared that the only woman among the 53 inmates of the Northumberland County Jail would attempt suicide. Despite removing all possible weapons from her cell, Annie managed to injure herself. Meanwhile, at the urging of Dr. McKay, an insanity panel was set up to determine if Annie was mentally healthy. However, for every person who said Annie was acting strangely before the crime, there were twice as many who claimed Annie was faking it to avoid paying for her heinous act. As the court date approached, Annie Buggy's behavior became increasingly erratic. Despite being closely monitored, Annie made 2 more suicide attempts in prison. Despite these dramatic behaviors, Annie remained unharmed. Whether Annie Buggy was feigning insanity or not, her behavior convinced the commission that she was not fit to stand trial. On May 15th, she was transferred to Danville State Hospital, and 2 years later she was declared recovered and released. Annie Buggy would never face a jury for killing a 3-year-old child in a fit of jealousy. After her release from the hospital in March 1919, she returned to Shamokin, whose residents had all but forgotten her act. But James Buggy had not forgotten. As soon as Annie was discharged from the mental hospital, he petitioned for a full and absolute divorce. Perhaps because of her reputation, Annie never remarried and lived in the neighborhood for the rest of her life, remaining inconspicuous. The date of her death is unknown. As for James Buggy, he lived the rest of his life in the same house, passing away from a lingering illness in April 1962. He remained a good citizen to the end of his life, serving on the Cole Township Board of Education, and was a member of the Holy Name Society at St. Joseph's Church for several decades. If you liked this story, subscribe to the channel and put a thumbs up. Look forward to more stories from the team of our channel. This is Criminal.